So I'm talking about the shifting notions of East Central Europe. So we are at the crossroads of understanding geography in the physical sense of the word and the dissolution of traditional geography by the digital universe. And as we talk, we are witnessing political efforts to exploit both. As Piotrowski mentions in his book In the Shadow of Yalta, the contemporary art of East Central Europe was put on the map of the international neo-avant-garde by Klaus Groh when he published Aktuelle Kunst in Osteuropa in 1972. The existence of quote-unquote East Central Europe, let alone its art, has not always been a cartographic fact. As is well known, until the end of World War I, parts of the territory it occupies today used to be known as the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the Russian Empire. This captures part of the East Central European experience, the shifting of political borders above the heads of masses of people of one or another ethnicity. One and the same village belongs once to Poland, then to Russia or Lithuania, to Hungary or to Slovakia, to Romania or to Moldavia, and so on, often back and forth. In East Central Europe, various demographic groups had, often throughout several centuries, their own history, which did not overlap with that of the country or state within the borders of which they found themselves. Regarding the international position of art in East Central Europe and the discourse about it, falling off the master narrative of international Western art, I would cite Jan Białostocki's distinction of peripheral and provincial, that had already been given some attention, according to which provincial art is indebted to the art of the center and is often a cheap imitation of it, while the best of peripheral art is equal to the art of the center in quality, if different in character, often resulting from a fruitful misunderstanding of it. While a fête de village in Provence or the Oktoberfest in Munich celebrate local tradition and belonging, confirming age-old identity, the folkloric traditions of Hungarians in Transylvania or the ethnic Serbs in Hungary, to give but two examples out of many, are colored by demonstrating difference from their state, asserting themselves as a minority with their own history and tradition, their own language, and usually within their own unofficial borders, drawn inside a county or a town. Geography in East Central Europe is not solid. The last time the map was redrawn, once again, was after 1989. Czechoslovakia split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. The former Yugoslavia split into its former member states, and the Soviet Union also fell into its pieces. At that point, Piotrowski writes, I quote him, critics and curators began to question the usefulness of such geographic framing of art, end quote. Meaning the regional concept of a geographic area referred to as Central Europe or East Central Europe. Now, one of the questions was how far Eastern Europe reaches as it now includes the Ukraine and the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. There is a 2007 publication titled Arrivals, Art from the New Europe, that adds Malta and Cyprus to the region, opening up a new inquiry about geography. The dynamics that Emanuel Wallerstein describes as, quote, the shifting and problematic functioning of the notions of center and periphery, end quote, became a real-time experience. The geopolitical status of East Central Europe can indeed be examined in the framework that Wallerstein offers concerning the dynamics of centers and peripheries. According to his theory, it is the concentration of economic and political power that turns a location, a city, a country, or a border region, into a center. Core economic and political locations will, in due course, according to him, develop into cultural centers as well. Centers unfailingly featured in the past strong central governments, extensive bureaucracy, and large mercenary armies, which enabled them to benefit the most from the world economy. By contrast, the zones that Wallerstein considers peripheral, for example, Eastern Europe or Latin America, lacked strong central governments or were controlled by other states that kept them in economic dependence. Aware of the incessant shift in power relations that leaves room for transitional formations and are reflected in cartographic shifts, Wallerstein, as well as a number of other authors, explored a third category, that of the semi-peripheries, which are either former core regions on the decline or former peripheries on the rise. Semi-peripheral position entails being exploited by the core, but also exploiting states on the periphery. Emphasizing the flexibility and the combination of geographical, social, and political conditions, he describes these regions as possibly mixing both core and peripheral forms of organization. Because of the uneven development, ambiguities, and indeed in-betweenness of Central and Eastern Europe, the flexibility of the term semi-periphery seems to be the most accurate for it. Looking back at the turns of history, in the wake of World War I, when the map of Europe was once again redrawn, Austria and Germany were geographically as well as culturally part of Central Europe and provided refuge to a number of emigres from other Eastern and East Central European countries, fleeing from their newly conservative political regimes. The socialist-governed Weimar Republic and Red Vienna sustained something of the dual empire's pre-war liberal spirit. The Bauhaus, for example, attracted an international crowd of students, many of whom arrived from Eastern Europe. In that sense, a lot of the East Central European avant-gardes happened in the territory of Germany and some in Vienna. After World War II and the Sovietization of the geographic area east of Austria, plus the GDR, the Iron Curtain marked a new political border projected onto the map. The term Central Europe, Mitteleuropa, coined in 1915 by Friedrich Naumann, disappeared from the vocabulary. The area was now referred to as the socialist countries, or after 1955, the Warsaw Pact countries, rather than Eastern Europe. Thus, a political power structure claimed cartographic validity during most of the post-World War II period. A revision started after the 1975 Helsinki Accords, when human rights in the Warsaw Pact countries, with the consent of their governments, started to be monitored by Western governments and watchdog agencies. The subsequent rise of East Central Europe to a kind of virtual prominence among Western politicians and the cultural discourse was reflected by the resorting to the old new name of the region, Central Europe, in the 1980s, with a nod to its expected integration into Western Europe. The term Central Europe also referred to the actual geographic center point of the continent, allegedly this is Prague, as the heart of an emerging new Europe, humanistic and enlightened all over. The old new term was used in the new discourse of Central European intellectuals, hopeful of political reforms and active in achieving them, like Milan Kundera, Václav Havel, György Konrad, Adam Michnik, Danilo Kish, and others. And the term appeared in the comments of Western observers eager to foster a European integration of the region, like Timothy Garton Ash, Jacques Rupnik, Tony Judt, and others. It appeared that the narrative had changed, and the European Schwerpunkt shifted east. East Central Europe became, for ever so shortly, the vogue. Prominent intellectuals like Jürgen Habermas, Hans Magnus Enzensberger, Allen Ginsberg, and Susan Sontag visited Central European cities and established personal connections there. Attention to Central Europe peaked in 1989-90, when communism collapsed on this symbolic border, the Berlin Wall went down. This was cartography in the making, under everyone's eyes, a physical and symbolic border disappearing peripheries embraced by the center. Or so was the promise. Defying geography, East Central European art has, over the last century, oscillated between openness to Western art, the artists identifying themselves as actually part of it, and the opposite, asserting that there is a specifically East Central European art. This dualism is manifest in art as well as its historiography. There are narratives that include only the history of the progressive, future-bound art, modernism and the avant-gardes, as well as the contemporary art and the neo-avant-gardes of East Central Europe. On the other hand, there exist different narratives of the art that tend to insulate the individual countries, that glorify the real or invented national past, the art of interwar neoclassicism, and the national trends in the arts of the respective cultures of the region. Both kinds of narratives originate from the same geographic areas, reflecting the split cultures of the region. In agreement with Wallerstein, Irit Rogov says in her book Terra Infirma that geography is, quote, established at the centers of power, which have the authority to subsume others into their hegemonic identity. Critical activity, which locates geography as its field, therefore, pursues an active form of unnaming, renaming, and the revising of such power structures in terms of the relations between subjects and places, end quote. Renaming regions, towns, and streets is familiar to us from older as well as the recent history in East Central Europe, as they follow the redrawing of borders or the ruling of a new political power. But in recent art, too, we see active critique of the geographic status quo. For example, the Slovenian art group NSK, calling their capital city Ljubljana by its previous German name Laibach, and using German rather than Slovenian as their language of choice. Historical references abound in many artworks in the region critiquing the former totalitarian systems directly, or as Slavoj Žižek suggests, by quote-unquote over-identifying with them, a theory I must admit I do not find clear enough. As an example of rejecting the actual geographic borders, we can point to many Hungarian artists of the 1960s and 70s who were open to the gestural, abstract trend in painting. French Taschism like Károly Klimó, Ákos Birkas, or the early István Nadler and Ilona Keserű crossing the geographic and political borders in their state for identifying with a wider European culture. However, references to Hungarian folk art in a newly minted abstraction by, for example, Nadler and Keserű pointed not only to the then suppressed national tradition, but they were also politically challenging the dominant and enforced Soviet ideology of quote-unquote proletarian internationalism. We must be reminded that there was hardly any regional consciousness in the area prior to 1989. East Central Europeans considered themselves Europeans, with the particular circumstance of being under Soviet occupation. European literature and art history were taught in schools seamlessly woven together with local tradition. An increased sense for absurdity discerned in the East Central European sensibilities identified as a specific local tradition, emblematically represented by Kafka, Hašek, UNESCO, and others. The turbulent years since 1989 demonstrate that multiple processes have been going on in the region, quite visibly in the art too. While some political changes have overwritten the geographic borders, joining NATO, the European Union, and the forming of the Visegrad Four, well, whatever it is today, these moves are paralleled by the simultaneous rise of the opposite concept, that of the solidly buttoned-up nation-state. As opposition to globalism, populist regimes, nationalism, and to varying degrees, economic downturn are developments that challenge the artists of East Central Europe, once again shifting and floating their identity as firmly European. I don't really have time. I wanted to say a few words about an initiative in Budapest that started 3 years ago called the Off Biennale, basically just calling attention to the concept and to the name of it. Of course, it is not the only Off Biennale in the globe, but it is a tongue-in-cheek name that is reflecting the sense of belonging and not belonging, and also the possibility that although we are in this place, this location, this geographic point, Budapest, we can be off it as well. And there is an artistic event we can organize, which is local as well as international, and can just quit that concept of firmly being stuck to one certain location. And lastly, parallel to the rise of interest in East Central European art, starting in the late 1960s, another process has been underway that I think deserves attention. Exhibitions and publications are increasingly conceptualized along trends and themes rather than geographic entities, or explore previously overlooked connections between remote geographical locations. For example, Eastern or East Central Europe and South America are paired. This global outlook, it was a recent MoMA exhibition as well as our conference in Lublin. This global outlook, reaching out for artworks in any media, location, national or ethnic group, dominates big international exhibitions, mitigating national identities. However, I would like to argue, cultures such as the East Central European ones have a lot to add to the international discourse due to accumulated historic experience, strategies of resistance, and valuing hard-earned cultural independence. Thus, I would complement Piotr Piotrowski's concept of horizontal art history with the vertical dimension of history, which plays an important role in East Central European art as it appears on the world stage. Thank you.